constructed humanitarianism, CIMIC isn't possible, because humanitarian organizations want full neutrality and don't want to be associated to fighting forces or military entities, be it using their assets to move people, materials, goods, food, whatever it is, or being seen as being protected in terms of, in a military convoy. Some organizations are just unwilling to be seen in that light. Or
one of the great problems in this area is that there are so many definitions of CIMIC. So, for instance, NATO, the UK, European militaries term it civil military cooperation. The OCHA has a different definition of it. NGOs prefer civil military relations, and I think, you know, there's a really big job to actually define a common language in this area. But I mean, I guess for me, as working in the humanitarian policy area, what it ideally should be is about military and non-military organisations, including humanitarian organisations for the most part, coming together to really define what their different objectives are, what their different principles are, and where their comparative advantages lie in responding to crisis situations, whether natural disasters or conflict.
It's defined by the military as a sort of communications conduit, whereby two separated communities, the civil and the military, acting in some kind of an emergency scenario, communicate with each other. That's the official definition that you're going to find in the back of British doctrine, American doctrine. The precise wording is nuanced, but basically what they're talking about is a conduit.
I think different countries, different troop contributing countries, whether it be to a UN operation, a NATO operation, or a coalition of the willing, have themselves different traditions of dealing with civil military operations. The British, of course, always pride themselves on being very good at it, saying it goes back to a sort of almost a colonial tradition of operating in small numbers, getting out of the tank, taking off your helmet and shaking hands with the locals. I think there is clearly something to that if you compare it with this sort of high intensity approach and the emphasis on force protection in other cases, but it can also be exaggerated. But I do think it's interesting in the context of Afghanistan that people have pointed to the different ways in which different contingents, Germans, British and others, have approached dealing with the civilian side, with the NGOs, and the way in which they also dealt with the locals.
An effective way of structuring such communication is through something like the Afghanistan NGO Safety Office, whereby it is a collective organisation, it is a collective voice for communicating security concerns and safety concerns and what have you. And it also provides a vehicle for a certain anonymity for humanitarian agencies and things like that. So there are some lessons, I think, out there to be learned.
CIMIC officers would come in and give a brief on what's happening throughout the entire country, in which case a lot of the international organizations wouldn't really have a full picture outside of the regions or the areas of their own interest. That, I think, was by far the most effective tool of the CIMIC officer there.
The problem about that idea is that you're giving a personality to this conduit. I don't think it has one. I think it's just like a telephone or a tube that you speak through. it's a facility. Its effectiveness is really just a very technical thing. I think good cooperation, which is what you're talking about, doesn't rely on the institution so much that lies between them. It relies on the fact that they have very often wildly different interests, wildly different ways of looking at the same problem. And whether they cooperate well or badly has nothing to do with CIMIC, which is just a porter cabin in the yard full of well-intentioned people who try to make the thing work. But if it doesn't work, it's nothing to do with CIMIC. It's to do with the fact that these two communities, in that particular case, have totally different views on the same topic. The problem where you get antagonism and rivalry between the military in an intervention response and the civilian actors in intervention response, it's very easy, especially if it's an opposed response and there is an adversary somewhere in the operational space, to exploit that rift and set one community off against the other. If it's easy for the host government to do that, it's easy for the people who are opposing the host government and also the response to do that. And if you don't get a degree of cooperation, you get casualties, you get redundancy of effort, you get people duplicating each other. And so the benefit of having a good cooperative spirit is that you remove that. Now, how you secure that is obviously is a pretty loaded question, because it's a matter of who's trying to secure it. And I think what we haven't really talked about is the fact that there is the military version of this cooperation, and there is a civilian version of the cooperation. And it matters enormously about the environment which you're in. If you're in Afghanistan or Iraq, which is really a proxy war zone, and the situation is contested by insurgents on the ground who are very effective, and they can really interdict the international response in a very damaging way, then obviously it's got to be a militarily led response, because the most pressing problem is security. And the military want to have a holistic response to the problem of restoring a monopoly of violence. And so you're going to have a form of cooperation which is on military terms, which is deeply uncomfortable to the humanitarian actors. And quite honestly, the best way of, I mean, if you're asking me, the best way of securing that is to get rid of a substantial element of the humanitarian sector from that scenario. And it is not a comfortable scenario for them to be in, even if the military weren't exercising this preeminence in the community, because whether they like it or not, they're in the target frame along with everybody else. So the idea of them having a humanitarian space in which they can act is a bit problematic. And they might see themselves as being separated from the military community, which is fine. But if their adversary doesn't see them in that light, and if their adversary sees them in the same target frame as the military and everyone else, the idea of a humanitarian space is a load of bollocks. And so
I mean, the example of provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan is a very interesting one. It's not clear whether it's going to be a model that's going to be replicated in other situations. And frankly, there are mixed views about their effectiveness, both in their own terms, in terms of achieving a measure of security and extending the Afghanistan government's authority to particular provinces, but also their success in managing this relationship between military operators and civilian organisations, particularly humanitarian. Each one is completely different from the other, and it depends on who is directing and running them. So, coalition or Operation Enduring Freedom structures are run in a very different way to the ISAF models, and even within ISAF there are different national approaches. So the UK approach is very different to the German approach, for instance. What seems to be common threads coming out of them is that PRT approaches are most effective in maintaining productive civil and military cooperation, where the military focuses on their core competencies, which are maintaining security and particular perimeter security, and or engaging in large-scale infrastructure projects, which are things that civilian agencies don't have in quite the same measure. And where humanitarian organisations, for instance, focus on their core competencies. So there's less of a chance of blurring lines, and there's also a greater chance of being effective in their respective spheres. Where the absolute controversies have come, as we know, is where military operators have engaged in activities where they've represented themselves as civilian operators, which is both contrary to international humanitarian law and incredibly confusing in a practical sense as well for local populations, and that has demonstrable flow-on effects to the ability of other civilian agencies, particularly humanitarian agencies, in maintaining their own relations and maintaining their own standards of safety.
Our response instrument is so clumsy, and so you asked me what is the biggest issue for the future, and the biggest threat to the idea of civil-military cooperation is the fact that the thing we have at the moment is simply incapable of taking the initiative in this contest that we are finding ourselves in the moment. And in the end, I think governments must get fed up. We'll have to no longer bear that squabbling sort of mess that presents itself at the operational level, and they will have to tidy it up. And the obvious way of tidying it up is to get rid of the sector which is unmanageable. And the sector which is unmanageable is definitely the civil sector. And how do you get rid of it? You subcontract it.
It's like apples and oranges to humanitarianism. It's just a different language. The military has a very, very specific way of doing it. If the issues aren't done in that way, they don't get done at all. And in a lot of cases, that was a problem because the international NGOs didn't know how to do it the military way, and the militaries didn't either have the time or the experience to explain that process. So often it got lost along the way.
Part of the common challenge now is to really, for humanitarian agencies in particular, to really demonstrate their professionalism and their credibility in these operating environments, in making a difference for local populations in terms of their health and their safety, and doing it in a way that demonstrates that they do it better than any other agency, because I think that there is, as I say, ongoing public policy drive to use all of the instruments available to governments, military, private, what have you. And humanitarians have a real challenge ahead to demonstrate their effectiveness and demonstrate the imperative of saving lives in an impartial and an impartial way that's independent of strategic interests.